Hello, everybody. Welcome to the seminar sessions organized by the Seniors Chemist Committee of the Southern California section of ACS. And we are actually conducting the seminar under a grant that we received from the National American Chemical Society. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Roger Turner. Dr. Turner is a museum curator at the Science History Institute in Philadelphia. He studies how science and technology have shaped the modern world, ranging from chemistry labs to pollution control to weather forecasting. At the Science History Institute, Roger has worked on Instruments of Change, a playful digital museum exhibit that introduces 5 scientific instruments significant for 20th century chemistry. He developed Science Matters, the case of rare earth elements, a science curriculum module where high school students can learn about sustainable technology by role-playing as stakeholders in rare earth metals production. One of his recent magazine articles recovers the story of a blind biochemist whose experiments with LSD in the 1950s helped transform science's understanding of mind and body. Most recently, he created a digital exhibit about the emerging field of mechanochemistry titled The Science of Crush. Dr. Turner earned his Ph.D. in the History and Sociology of Science from the University of Pennsylvania in 2010. His research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the American Meteorological Society, and the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. When he is not thinking about history, he likes to birdwatch with his family in the forests of central Pennsylvania. And with this brief introduction and welcome once again, everybody, I pass it on to Dr. Roger Turner.
Thank you so much, Krishna. Delighted to be here today. And we have quite a windstorm going on outside my house right now. So if that, I hope that doesn't come through on the microphone, but if it does, just know that the trees are not breaking up the wind quite as much as they used to now that it's the winter. I'm really happy to be here and have a chance to share this story about the battle against air pollution. This is one of my favorite talks to give and my favorite stories to tell, especially because I love the images and the photographs from the 1950s and the 1960s here. There should be plenty of time for questions at the end, and I'm particularly interested in any of the questions that the students have. So I hope we'll have a chance to have a nice exchange of ideas, and maybe if there's something that comes up in the talk that you'd like to know more about, please let me know and shoot me a question at the end of the talk. All right, with that, I will take it away. All right. Well, my story is set in sunny, smoggy Los Angeles. It's the early 1950s, the era of Raymond Chandler and Dragnet. It's a boom time. The population is swelling, commerce is humming, and people are in love with their automobiles. But it's also a time of smog, as every breather in Los Angeles knows. On some days, the polluted air makes people's eyes water, makes their throat hurt, and leaves them short of breath. But it's a time when it wasn't clear just what smog was. People didn't know why the air was sometimes more irritating and sometimes less. And behind those puzzles lay politically charged questions. What caused smog? Who would have to change to stop the smog? So today we're going to learn the answers to those questions, at least as they were haggled out by Californians back then. And along the way, we're going to meet 4 remarkable characters. For now, I'll just call them the musician, the athlete, the militant, and the activist. In our story, we're going to see chemistry and government and public protests in action. We'll notice the subtle connections between knowledge and power. And I want you to keep your eyes on the business leaders and watch how they interact with scientists. Those 2 groups are going to gradually reframe smog as a problem best solved by researchers and engineers. They'll transform the mental storylines that Californians use to make sense of air pollution. Cleverly, inevitably, they're going to blame LA's smog on Detroit's car makers. Well, now that you know what to look for, let's dive into the story. So people first began to recognize LA's smog problem during World War II in the summer of 1943. On July 8th, a confounding haze settled over the city. Amidst the tears and coughing came rumors of a Japanese poison gas attack. But as the smoggy days came and went into September, public blame fell on a new chemical plant that was making butadiene, a crucial component in synthetic rubber. The plant was eventually closed down, and smog went down too. It was almost certainly wartime gas rationing that temporarily reduced the smog, but nobody knew that then. After the war, smog was back and worse than ever. In 1947, Los Angeles created a first-of-a-kind air pollution control district. And this new bureaucracy initially focused on reducing black smoke and soot and stinky sulfur dioxide, the air pollutants that were the bane of the coal-fired Midwest. A year later, though, a smog wave killed 19 people. With no progress on reducing smog, the pollution district manager, an engineer named Gordon Larson, hired an outside consultant for advice in 1948. So now we meet our first character, the musician. The district's consultant was a chemist named Arnold Beckman. He was a transplant to California. He'd grown up in rural Illinois in a town of 580 people, just a tiny town. He'd been a tenured professor at Caltech who walked away to manufacture the electronic pH meter he had invented in the 1930s. He was a staunch Republican, a businessman, and an industrialist. He loved to drive cars, fast, and he put his children in charge of watching out for traffic cops when he raced between his home in Pasadena and his factory in Fullerton. Traffic was a lot less in Los Angeles in those days. In his leisure time, Beckman was a musician. He played the piano, and he paid his way through college by leading a dance band in the early 1920s. And as we'll see, he could play people as well as the piano. Now, Beckman didn't believe that smog was caused by industrial pollution. Beckman sniffed, and he told the pollution district manager that noses would detect sulfur dioxide long before it would reach the levels that would be irritating to humans. So Beckman went looking for a different cause. He recruited his old Caltech colleague, Arie Haagen-Smit, to the problem. Haagen-Smit is our second character. Like Beckman, Haagen-Smit was a chemist and a California transplant, but he was different in almost every other way. He was an immigrant from Utrecht, a lifelong Democrat, a biochemist who was happiest in his laboratory. Haagen-Smit enjoyed rowing and boxing, and he was quite competitive about things. In fact, everyone agreed that the Dutchman had the largest biceps of any member of the Caltech family, the Caltech biology faculty, at least until 1960. After 1960, he always wore a sport coat with sleeves so that he would look respectable in case he was interviewed on campus. And his colleague said, quote, "It was no longer possible to check on the status of his biceps," which tells you a lot about the preoccupations of the Caltech biology faculty. Now, Haagen-Smit was studying flavor chemistry. Not an obvious match for the problem of smog, right? But the experimental technique that he was using was the key. He would blow air over huge piles of crushed pineapple and then use a liquid nitrogen cold trap to condense out the volatile flavoring components that evaporated. I really wish I could find an actual picture of Haagen-Smidt's, the equipment that he was actually using for that. I don't think this is it, but this is the best I could do. And so Beckman and Haagen-Smit decided to remove the pineapple and instead sucked thousands of liters of smoggy air through the cold trap. They condensed out a few drops of brown goo, which Haagen-Smidt's analysis revealed was peroxy material, a variety of organic acids and other partially oxidized hydrocarbons, the kind of stuff that might be left behind when gasoline got only partly burned. In short, his findings suggested that cars were a big part of the problem. Now, and I'm sure you'll be shocked to learn this, the oil industry tried to cast doubt on these scientific findings that threatened their business. They hired Abe Zarum at the Stanford Research Institute to analyze those peroxy materials extracted from the smoggy air. Haagen-Smit was eager to get back to studying pineapple, but Arnold Beckman understood psychology. He arranged for Abe Zarum to come to Caltech and give a lecture, and then Beckman made sure that Haagen-Smit came too, and sat right next to him. The oil industry's chemist said that he had studied these peroxy compounds and found that they were not eye irritating. He said that he didn't smell anything, they didn't smell or anything like that, as Beckman later remembered. Sorry, let's go back to Abe. Zerum continued, "It's unfortunate that a chemist of Haagen-Smith's caliber could be misled like this." As you can imagine, Haagen-Smit was indignant. "Well, who's telling me that I don't know what to do?" he said. So Haagen-Smit took a year's leave of absence from Caltech just to focus on smog research. By 1951, he had traced out a series of reactions showing how hydrocarbons in car exhaust could interact with sunlight and nitrogen oxides to produce ozone. This was promising. Ozone was known to irritate eyes and lungs. It was a powerful oxidant, the kind of molecule that could tear apart the bonds that held other molecules together. And as LA drivers knew only too well, natural rubber tires broke down rapidly on bad smog days. So Haagen-Smith's next challenge was to show that the levels of ozone and other oxidants rose and fell in sync with how people experienced smog in their bodies. He needed a machine that could measure oxidant levels in the low parts per million in the air blowing across Southern California. So Arnold Beckman came to the rescue. Beckman dusted off a mustard gas detector that he had developed during World War II. The instrument ran treated air samples through a solution of phenolphthalein, right? That's the same indicator used in litmus paper, to measure quite low concentrations of poison gas blowing in the wind. This somewhat fragile instrument was no good on the battlefield, but it worked just fine in the lab. So bubbling a few liters of smoggy air through a phenolphthalein solution soon turned this otherwise colorless liquid an alarming shade of red. A colorimeter measured the shade, and the equivalent concentration was printed onto a continuous tape. This new oxidant recorder could measure the oxidizing potential of smoggy air. Within a few years, Beckman Instruments was marketing the device under the name Acrylizer. So between them, Beckman and Haagen-Smit had developed a theory of smog formation and an instrument to measure it. Haagen-Smith's lab experiments suggested smog was produced by reactions that take place in the atmosphere, not at factories. They argued that it was ozone, an invisible gas that made smog irritating and cracked tires. They described a photochemical reaction where ozone is created when partially burned hydrocarbons interact with sunlight. So their answer to the question, what caused smog, was partially burned hydrocarbon molecules. And to the question, what would have to change to stop smog, their answer was elegant, if not technologically easy. Simply fully burn those hydrocarbons so that you're left with nitrogen and water and carbon dioxide. Now, Arnold Beckman's service on the Air Pollution Committee of the LA Chamber of Commerce had connected him to California's Republican establishment, including the new governor, Goodwin Knight. And Knight asked Beckman to propose a set of solutions for smog. In November 1953, Beckman and Haagen-Smit and a few others on their committee delivered their report. They suggested that eliminating the region's ubiquitous low-temperature backyard trash incinerators, up there on the top. They suggested reducing hydrocarbon evaporation, and they suggested especially controlling automobile exhaust. Car registrations in Los Angeles had increased by 70%, and truck numbers had more than doubled in the decade since World War II. Haagen-Smit figured that automobile engines were responsible for about half or so of the region's smog problem. So Gordon Larson followed the science, and he shifted the focus of the Air Pollution Control District to car exhaust and getting rid of trash incinerators. But as Southern California's mountains faded behind increasingly thick brown haze, some residents believed that Larson had lost sight of the real culprits. Why blame ordinary people rather than tackling politically powerful industries that produce more visible emissions, like the oil refineries and the oil burning manufacturers? When pollution experts appointed by Governor Knight tried to reassure the public that smog presented no health hazard, well, at least it didn't cause cancer. We were pretty confident of that. Suspicions grew that the elected officials were more interested and concerned with protecting the financial health of their political patrons than the physical health of their constituents. All right, imagine it's October 20th, 1954. You live in Pasadena, And it's been a solid 2 weeks since you've been able to see the San Gabriel Mountains through the stinging, acrid air. It's also the day that the ban on your backyard incinerator goes into effect. You and your suburban neighbors have had enough. An insurance salesman and a radio announcer have called a mass meeting at Pasadena Civic Auditorium. When you get there, the crowd is overflowing onto the sidewalk. Inside, Frank Packard, the insurance salesman, is decrying the scientific mumbo jumbo and the bureaucratic inertia that have kept the government from solving this smog problem. You watch a film showing heavy traffic on the parkways producing no visible vapors, while the refineries billow huge clouds of smoke. The radio announcer takes to the podium and he asks you all, "Has the public been fooled by facts and figures?" "Yes, yes," you shout. "Do you believe the governor's expert who says smog poses no health hazard?" You and 3,000 other people roar, "No!" Now, out of this October meeting, which was the largest anti-pollution rally in California prior to Earth Day in 1970, what emerged was the Citizens Anti-Smog Action Committee, with 38 local councils in communities across the LA basin. These councils announced that they wanted to take the discussion of smog, quote, out of the scientific laboratories and into the hands of the people. Now, this new anti-smog activism represented a serious threat to the commercial and the industrial leaders who had long dominated LA's politics, the kind of businessmen who ran the Chamber of Commerce. Plus, LA's business leaders also recognized that a smoggy reputation really risked damaging the city's prospects for future growth. Now, here's one of my all-time favorite historical photos. This is the Highland Park Optimus Club, and they decided in 1954 to have a banquet while wearing gas masks to protest the smog. The sign behind them says, "Why wait until 1955? We might not even be alive." Or just a reminder, these are the optimists of 1954. And I think maybe more significantly for the businessmen, in the Beckman archives here at the Science History Institute, there's a letter from a real estate manager that was sent in 1956 saying that he was working with a mortgage investor that would, quote, consider no further loans in Los Angeles until our smog is under control. So the men of the Chamber of Commerce reacted to this in two ways. First, they told the Air Pollution District to make the fight against pollution dramatic and visible. The County Board of Supervisors demoted the hapless Gordon Larson, and they brought in a new director. And here is when we meet our third character, the militant. Maybe I should call him the officer. That might be a little more appropriate, but we'll let you guys judge that. So this new director was Smith Griswold, a vigorous Naval Reserve officer. One newspaper said he was ruggedly handsome with a determined set of jaw, while another claimed that he had, quote, the piercing gaze of a John Brown. And like that militant abolitionist who attacked Harper's Ferry Armory in 1859, Griswold was willing to risk his own body in the fight. Griswold declared war on smog. So first, Griswold ramped up the work of what he called the Pollution Division Striking Force, right? He put the Enforcement Division officers on patrol 24 hours a day, ordering them to chase down smoking vehicles using their lights and sirens. He created a standing air patrol working with the Los Angeles County Sheriff to find polluters from above. He also hired more inspectors and publicized the exponential increase in citations against industrial polluters. And he beefed up the Air Pollution Control District's research staff, casting them as his intelligence division, charged with monitoring the enemy. Beckman acrylizers were purchased and installed around the city to warn when ozone levels began to climb. And Griswold even got permission from the civil defense authorities to sound the air raid sirens and to order traffic off the county's roads if pollutants reached dangerous levels. Now, while the sirens did blare occasionally in politically restive Pasadena, shutting down traffic was definitely a step too far for Griswold. He never tried that. Instead, Griswold launched a public education campaign to try and persuade residents that the invisible gases from cars and incinerators were really the main cause of smog. The pollution district began a monthly newsletter, which was illustrated with striking photographs and really lots and lots of cartoons. Griswold and other senior pollution district officials presented exhibits, and they gave lectures to the optimists and women's clubs and other civic groups. High school and college students competed in essay contests to explain the causes of smog and to research solutions. They even got together with radio station KABC to produce the show Smog Story, a weekly 15-minute radio program that explained what the district was accomplishing and how residents could help in the fight themselves. I've read the transcript for this, but I've never been able to hear the audio. So I would love to, if anybody ever encounters the audio for this, please get in touch with me. I'd love to hear it. But my favorite move of Griswold's took place in a greenhouse hooked up to an ozone generator. In July of 1956, Griswold rolled up his shirt sleeves, sat down, and smiled for the cameraman. Then his employees turned on the ozone machines. 2 hours later, Griswold stumbled out. He was sweating, blinking, coughing. The ozone had made his Coca-Cola taste strange and disrupted his concentration. He had to think carefully before speaking. As he told the reporters, "I volunteered for this test to learn firsthand the physiological and psychological effects that people may be called upon to endure during smog attacks." Griswold was saying that in this war, he was fighting and suffering alongside everyone else. Now, although the pollution control district's work was dramatic, it wasn't the only strategy that was employed by LA's business leaders to deflect the heat. So let's check out the second strategy, which is that they tried to change the way people thought about smog. They sought to reframe smog as a technical and a scientific problem, not a political one, not something that was best handled, put in the hands of the people, but that was properly handled in the hands of the scientific laboratories and the engineers. And the vehicle that they used to drive home this message, if you like, was the Air Pollution Foundation, a private philanthropy funded by hundreds of thousands of dollars solicited from the Chamber of Commerce's leading members, right? California manufacturers, civil engineering firms, bankers, the oil industry, even local hotel magnates, all the companies that depended on and were profiting from Southern California's booming growth in the 1950s. The Air Pollution Foundation announced that it would try to end smog by funding scientific and technical research. It established a scientific team charged with, as they put it, impartial fact-finding without fear or favor. Arnold Beckman was the chair of its research committee, responsible for choosing the projects to fund. And at the same time, he was president of the Chamber of Commerce. So he helped to keep LA's powerful business elite, and increasingly the state's Republican establishment focused on reducing smog as well. Preferably, of course, by making Detroit automakers solve the problem. Now, the Air Pollution Foundation sponsored research into many aspects of smog and its effects. While the foundation did endorse building regional mass transportation and carpooling, it never considered limiting growth or advocating for building denser cities that would not require so much driving. Most of the foundation's grants instead went towards making internal combustion engines less noxious. Some grantees invented ways to recirculate exhaust gases. Others developed potential catalytic converters, and still others created afterburners that could complete the combustion of the hydrocarbons at the tailpipe. One of the big problems with this is that they were extremely, extremely hot, and just a single touch would give you a third-degree burn. And so it was decided that probably the afterburner was a bad idea to put on the back end of everybody's car. Now, these grants stimulated experiments and measurements, but they did not yield production cars equipped with smog control devices. And the Air Pollution Control Foundation blamed the automakers for this failure. So did Smith Griswold. As Griswold wrote in 1956, "We have put it to Detroit that smog is not merely a phenomenon of Los Angeles or of Southern California, but is rather an attribute inherent in the automobile itself." Griswold didn't then blame local citizens for driving, nor did he blame planners or developers for creating a region that was dependent on cars. And Southern California here was ahead of the nation as a whole in becoming sort of dependent on automobiles at this time. But it was really a harbinger for where the whole country was increasingly going. Instead, these sort of cars were smog ogres, right, as the picture before showed. But Griswold thought the auto industry could make them less monstrous by reducing the ozone and nitrogen dioxide emissions. The automobile industry just had to invest some money into protecting public welfare. Some of that money that they spent on making cars fashionable and stylish and changing from year to year just needed to go into the technological solutions to smog. But as LA's smog continued to get worse into the 1960s, Griswold just ratcheted up his attacks on Detroit. By 1964, he was describing the automakers as, quote, crusted with ignorance and apathy, adding that, quote, everything that the industry is able to do today to control auto exhaust was possible technically 10 years ago. And when Griswold left Los Angeles for a job leading air pollution control in the federal government, he carried with him to the national level the idea that air pollution is a problem that should be solved by engineers and scientists. His years of anti-smog work contributed to the passage of the 1970 Clean Air Act, which mandated catalytic converters on all new cars sold in the United States starting in 1975. But we're missing something really important if we just leave it there. You've noticed, I'm sure, that every name I've said so far belongs to a man. And I bet you've also noticed that there have been quite a number of women in the pictures of protesters and scientific workers. Women were decisive in the battle against air pollution in Los Angeles in the 1950s and the 1960s. As historian Scott Hamilton Dewey puts it, women mobilized and educated themselves about air pollution to become frequently among the most knowledgeable, forceful, and even radical champions of air pollution control in their communities. And so that brings us to our fourth character, the activist. Margaret Levy, she went by Marge, lived in Beverly Hills, where she was married to a movie producer. Her father-in-law was one of Hollywood's top agents, representing stars like Mary Pickford and Joan Crawford. She was fearless and quick-witted, and when Marge's 2-year-old daughter was hospitalized after an asthma attack, the doctors told her to move to a place with cleaner air. She said the family couldn't leave Los Angeles, so she'd just have to cure air pollution instead. Levy was a founding member of Stamp Out Smog in 1958. SOS, as they called themselves, was a group of upper middle class women, many of whom were married to famous actors, television personalities, and movie producers. They were geniuses in terms of publicity, as the writers Susie Swat and Steve Swat have noted. Just check out some of these two pictures from the birthday party that they threw for smog in 1964, 21 years after that first confounding haze during World War II. That's Afton Slade with the cake, who took over as president of SOS after Levy stepped back. Now, these mothers were powerful organizers, coordinating a coalition of more than 400 different groups in the fight against smog, and they could persuade their children to wear gas masks at rallies in public. I have trouble getting my kids just to take a bath. They could turn out large numbers of members to attend critical government hearings or write letters in support of new laws. Now, remember that anti-smog action committee whose rally you imagined attending back in Pasadena? Well, that group petered out as Stamp Out Smog emerged as the group that was far more effective at lobbying and organizing support. Of course, there were plenty of men ready to dismiss these activists because of their gender and because of their lack of official credentials. And one of the ways that the women of SOS got themselves taken seriously was by becoming experts on the technologies of smog control. They learned how catalytic converters and crankcase emissions control devices and afterburners worked in precise detail. They were not engineers or lab chemists, but they could explain the science and technology, and they knew when the automakers or pollution regulators were trying to mislead them. The thing is, that technique for being taken seriously dovetailed right with the LA Chamber of Commerce's strategy, right, for framing smog as a technical problem that could only be fixed by automotive engineers. Stamp Out Smog became some of Smith Griswold's most effective allies in the push for air pollution control. but it was a very particular kind and form of air pollution control, right? Air pollution controls that were built around engineering solutions at the built into, mostly built into cars or built into the top of smokestacks. All right, so let's wrap up. What can we learn from this story? Well, the Chamber of Commerce certainly succeeded in redirecting public anger about smog onto Detroit's automakers. Activists like Stamp Out Smog and progressive political champions like LA County Supervisor Kenneth Hahn embraced that framing that smog was caused by cars with inadequate exhaust systems. Hahn spent decades chasing after the CEOs of Detroit's Big Three, trying to get them to put smog-fighting technologies on cars. And when a popular historian like Jack Doyle looks back on smog control, he can rightfully blame Detroit for, as he puts it, almost 50 years of bobbing and weaving, producing, quote, a sordid tale of delay, missed opportunities, and serious environmental culpability, right? Detroit has deserves a lot of blame in this case. But eventually, the air pollution forces did win the battle for emissions controls. The Clean Air Act of 1970 and later amendments have gradually brought California's emissions inspection regime to most of the densely populated areas across the country. Federal law mandated that all new cars would have to have catalytic converters starting in 1975. And on a per vehicle basis, smog has been dramatically reduced, although it has taken decades. And can I just say how much I love this image? Just this one little tube will change the dragon's fire into, let's see, hearts and flowers and bees and birds. What an image. But, and I suppose here's the sad part of my talk, the battle for emissions controls might not have been the best one to fight. We got laws and technologies that eventually reduced ugly brown smog, but they have done little to reduce the other harms caused by a society that presumes that everyone drives their own personal car. The number of cars continues to increase, and the miles that individuals drive has increased even more. People spend a lot more times in their cars than they did in the 1950s. Policymakers and chambers of commerce have collaborated to build many landscapes where driving is practically obligatory. And while air pollution today is harder to taste and to see, it remains a major killer. The fine particulate matter created by tailpipe exhaust from cars and trucks causes an estimated 53,000 early deaths a year in the United States, comparable to the number of Americans who died from the opioid overdoses in 2015. I should note also that I live in an area that is has pretty intense air pollution and very elevated asthma rates. I live right near the intersection of Interstate 81 and the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and a spot that is within one legal day's truck drive of more Americans than any other place in the country. So we have a huge number of warehouses and a ton of diesel-powered trucks that are driving around our highways and local roads here in Carlisle. And even the victory over in emissions controls, to the extent that it is, has not been nearly as durable as it might seem, right? And we know that the last two Republican administrations have worked hard to undermine even existing air pollution regulations, let alone trying to better protect us. So I'm going to conclude with maybe an ambivalent message about science. On one hand, there's no doubt in this story that science matters, especially at first. Beckman and Haagen-Smith's lab work on the chemistry of smog was absolutely essential, as well as being brilliant, right? It helped us to know what smog was and which sources of air pollution mattered the most. But, and I suppose this will probably make me unpopular with the program officers at the National Science Foundation, so please don't tell them. Science isn't everything. Science doesn't solve problems on its own. And science can be used in ways that damage political organizing. The Air Pollution Foundation undercut mass protests by convincing Californians that smog was a technical problem best solved by engineers. Indeed, I think that's what it was established to do. But framing smog as a technical problem also obscured the significant ways that growth and sprawl and road building also contributed to air pollution. Near the end of his life, that proud Dutchman, Arie Haagen-Smit, confessed his regret that he had not done more to advocate for responsible city planning. If there's one thing that I want to leave you with, it's this. Focusing on science and technology can sometimes expand the ways that we think about solving societal problems, but it can also blind us to alternative solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. That was great. Does anyone have any questions? You can go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, I had a question for Roger. Roger, very interesting talk. I'm Surya Prakash, a chemistry professor at USC. And, I work on these kind of issues today. Mm-hmm. And in fact, when California had the smog problem, there was a very interesting engineer from Ford. Her name is Roberta Nichols. Roberta Nichols did a lot of experimentation in Los Angeles County to alleviate smog. She came up with alcohol fuels. In fact, methanol, which I work on right now, methanol, we wrote a book on methanol economy. Methanol is a very clean burning fuel in an internal combustion engine. It does not make any NOx, no nitrogen oxides because it burns cooler, the engine, no particulate emissions. And of course, methanol does not have any sulfur, no SOx either. So all these things were done. And in fact, Los Angeles County experimented with M85, 85% methanol, 15% gasoline, not ethanol, but methanol as a fuel. But the oil companies came and killed the whole program with adding MTBE as an additive. This happened in the late 80s. So actually to smog control, we have very good fuels, internal combustion fuels to handle. Even methanol could substitute diesel. So, so it gives very high torque. You can have very high compression ratios. So all these things were done in California and still, things have not happened. I just wanted to let you know that.
Yeah, thanks, Arie. Very interesting. It's fascinating to sort of see the range of solutions and the range of approaches that have been engaged with. And I think certainly thinking about the role of corporate power is really central in as we kind of think through the stories of air pollution.
Yeah, and what's interesting is Chinese cities are all using methanol as a drop-in fuel because they have much more pollution problem than US.
Great, thanks so much.
Sure.
Am I on?
Yep.
Oh,
Yes,
okay.
you're on.
Yeah, I was. This is Bill Turner, Roger's dad. I was struck by a picture that first picture you showed of Haagen-Smit, that he was smoking.
Yeah, in the lab.
And this being the 1950s, it struck me the parallels between air pollution in Los Angeles with the smog and smoking at the time, and how industry, the tobacco industry was disputing the fact that smoking caused cancer, and how resistant industries that whose financial destinies associated with these activities, how they understandably resist any kind of actions that might restrict them. So I just was interested in the fact that he was smoking actually while he was studying the effects of smog. I thought was kind of ironic.
Yeah, and it's very dangerous to smoke in a lab.
Yes.
Yeah, lots of explosive solvents and other chemicals.
Yeah,
I think it's a great point, and it's I one of the reasons I definitely made sure to include that image is it is so striking. And Haagen-Smit did die of cancer when I think 70, 77, 73, not real old. Yeah, one of the I think one of the most influential and significant books in the history of science in the last 10 years has been Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's book Merchants of Doubt, which explores some of the ways that that the strategies of doubt creation and the promotion of ignorance and confusion have been central to, you know, the same strategies that the tobacco companies used were used for air pollution and were used for ozone, the depletion of the ozone layer, and similarly for climate change, right? And so there's a real continuity in these strategies and techniques, and oftentimes, and at least you know, from the sort of the 1960s into the 1990s, a real continuity of individuals as well. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting parallel. And I really should add, there's a lovely, I should add to my slide deck a lovely image of a cigarette, from a cigarette ad that's talking about how their filters are so good that you'll barely be affected by the smoke, but you'll continue to be exposed to the smog, and that maybe you should just carry one of these around in your mouth and just breathe through it without the cigarette lit, because the filter is so good on it. So I have to find that and bring that out.
Interesting.
Any other questions
It looks like
from anybody?
Yes, I've got a question. I'm Robert Wagner, husband of Joylene Wagner, whose Zoom account I'm using. Would the complete adoption of the electric vehicle for both passenger cars and trucks completely eliminate smog in areas like metropolitan LA?
Well, I guess you know, I don't have a complete answer for that. I know that there is a degree of the particulate emissions come from tires as they're breaking down, and that's something that's not going to be eliminated from that. I suppose probably what I'm more thinking about in this talk is the kinds of harms that come from the assumption that everybody has their own car and everybody will be able to drive on their own car where they need to go, right? And building a system that expects that. And so I think that's a real problem for all kinds of people, right? It's a problem for people when their car breaks down. It's a problem for people when they, when because of physical or visual or mental disability, they can't drive and they become dependent on others. And obviously it's a real problem for people that can't afford cars or that can't afford reliable cars, right? And so we got to, starting to think of it as think of these systems much more holistically and much less just about technological solutions to the end of the tailpipe. We start to sort of see a different set of problems and a different set of people who are harmed by this.
Yeah, with the electric vehicles too, you need to worry about life cycle, because manufacturing batteries and extracting lithium and other metals is not so easy.
Yes, for sure. I'll talk some more about that on Wednesday when I talk about.
All right, looking forward to that talk. Yeah.
Yes, David, did I see David Munns had his hand up?
Hi, thanks, Roger. Well, I'm actually going to follow on from Bill Turner, because I think that's really great, because the notes I got on the image that really struck me was the one, of course, with Griswold in the greenhouse doing this sort of self-test. Like I remember a conversation with Katherine Jackson, who is a noted historian of chemistry herself, all about how chemists really like to take on these really dangerous self-tests. You're not a real chemist until you've attempted to blow yourself up with your latest experiment, and that's what really proves you in the metal of chemistry. And so this kind of notion about how do you prove something to your fellow scientists? You've got to take on the social norms that they sort of agree on publicly, but they also agree on privately. You basically have to put yourself in harm's way to make your point. And of course, it was in a greenhouse, which was interesting because the story I always heard was about the California agricultural industry, was also a big pusher against smog because they feared smog was really attacking the agricultural industry. So I'm sort of wondering at like this sort of larger, like social, the moral economy of chemistry and danger.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, just quickly on the agricultural side, it's, you know, that's very much a part of the story, and elsewhere, you know, I guess that's, yeah, that was sort of a decision. I was like, right, I should probably go find a few slides of the testing on plants and things like that, and it's all over the, you know, it's all over the primary sources there for sure. But I just didn't happen to stick that in this version of the talk. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really fascinating question in terms of thinking about kind of the personal exposure to danger. I mean, I think here Griswold is very much like this is a publicity stunt, and it's a way for him to establish his credibility with the public, right? And so to say but you know, but the bodily suffering is essential to that, right? So both that he knows what they're going through, but also that you know, it's not just empathy, it's also like that they will see him as a fellow smog sufferer, right? As somebody who understands it and knows the effect upon them as well. So I would love to know if I don't think Haagen-Smit spends any time personally exposing himself to these, you know, except for the cigarettes, to the air pollution. And Beckman manages to quite. He moves out of the lab. He's still working with instruments and doing some engineering work on the floor, but he's largely managing the business by the later point there. Yeah, but that's a fascinating topic, and it's lovely to think about that in relationship to these chemists.
Are there any other questions?
But really, I would really encourage if there are any of the students want to step forward or put a question in the chat. I'd love to know, you know, just a comment or as well of, you know, what you found interesting or what you found really surprising or different from what you know about already.
Well, if there are no further questions, then I thank Roger for a very nice, very scintillating talk, which combined history with the science and politics and whatnot and everything. And it has it stimulated a lot of interest, I think, in among the younger generation. And in fact, I was thinking on behalf of SCALACS, because the climate change is the hottest topic nowadays in the whole country, not only in the country, but the whole world, that we would try to establish a site in our on our website where we can actually discuss about the climate change. We can also put in articles about the climate change there in the site, and then we can also probably encourage students and their science teachers to come up with some sort of articles which we can actually put in the SCALACS website. And also I am thinking of planning a roundtable on climate change discussion with the science teachers and the students involved. And we would also encourage the students to come up with some articles of their own, which we can publish, and maybe even a few review articles, which we can publish in some of the ACS journals, especially the Journal of Chemical Education and things like that. So I would encourage the science teachers to help me out in setting up first this round table that we can discuss about the climate change and the past and present and the future and whatnot. And then actually we can go ahead and we can establish the site, and we can have exchange of ideas. And I have a lot of collection of literature articles and all that, which I am planning to put on the website with the permission of our executive committee. And then we can take it up from there. In fact, I confess I do have a few slides which I have collected myself with the objective of actually arousing the enthusiasm of the students who are listening to the very nice talk by Roger. And but because of the lack of time, I won't do that right now. I won't put in any slide. I don't want to button on Roger's very nice scintillating lecture and all that. So we will have some other occasion where we can actually set up, and I would like to invite the suggestions of teachers and also the students as to how we can proceed ahead with this climate change aspect, and especially with a little bit of focus on how the students would approach the problem, how the science teachers would actually approach the problem of teaching it to their students and things like that. So with that, I thank Roger very much for the very nice talk that he has given. I'm looking forward to the second one. And I know about the science history, the history of the Science History Institute, which I would probably, because I'm not going to introduce Roger again in the next talk, I would probably take a couple of minutes before he commences his talk to give a little bit of history about the Science History Institute before I will pass on the podium to Roger in the next talk on Wednesday. And thank you all audience for making it convenient to come over and listen to the talk that Roger has given. And thank you all, and I wish and I hope every one of you will show up for the second talk as well, if not more of you. Thank you very much.